this episode of Qualified Opinions, host Veronique De Rugy speaks with distinguished university professor of economics at George Mason University, Peter Boettke, about the evolution of economic thought, the fundamental role of prices in a free market, and a critique of modern government intervention.
Welcome to Qualified Opinion. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Peter Boettke, distinguished professor of economics at George Mason University and vice president for advanced study at the Marquette Center. I've known Pete forever. It seems he's one of the people that made my moving to the US possible. Thank you, Pete. I'll be forever grateful. He's also one of the leading contemporary Austrian economics scholars. In fact, in a recent essay at the Dispatch, he revisits F.A. Hayek's timeless warning about the danger of central economic planning. In an era where presidents talk about tariffs and state ownership as tool of industrial policy, and politicians like Zoran Mondani run on platform of democratic socialism, Boettke argued that Hayek's knowledge problem, the simple fact that no planner or model can ever possess the vast decentralized information embedded in price, is more relevant than ever. Welcome, Pete. I want to thank you again because really it's, without people like you and Ingrid Gregg, I wouldn't be here in the US. Ingrid through AIER provided the financing, but you're the one who made a spot for me at GMU at the time. And so I'm forever grateful, and I don't feel I tell you enough.
Well, I think that when people get involved and they give support to young scholars and just want to give them opportunity, when people make the most of the opportunities, it pays back huge dividends. And you've made more than enough of the opportunities. You've been one of the greatest champions for free markets in your generation. So thank you. Yeah. You
Right.
may, one of the things is that, when I used to coach basketball a lot, and I was fortunate enough, I'm in a local Hall of Fame here. And when I accepted my Hall of Fame speech, I said, it's easy to be considered a good coach when you have great players. Yeah. So it's easy to be considered a good sponsor of scholars when they turn out to be so talented like you. So
Yeah.
it's really an amazing thing to watch how you've stuck to your principles and tried to communicate as effectively as you can to such wide audiences. So
And
you're
yet,
bringing economics to the people.
here we are.
Yes. Yeah.
And I assume this is why you decided to write this article, which is called "What Hayek Understood About the Unknowable Nature of Markets,"
Yeah.
and it was published at the Dispatch on October 28th, 2025. So I assume this is why. I mean, because of where we are now, that you decided to write this piece. And so we see it all around us, right? The tariffs, the government taking stakes in private company, setting floor prices, effectively, really nationalizing the steel industry, and you were like, there's something that they do not understand, and so what is that? What is it?
Well, I mean, without security of private property rights, you can't get, functioning prices. And without functioning prices, you can't have advanced material production. And so the very reason why we live in a wealthy society is because we've had markets that have been able to, guided by prices, that have been able to generate tremendous amounts of innovation and technological change. The Nobel Prize this year was given in part to Joel Mokyr, and Mokyr's not the most recent book, but a relatively recent book is called The Culture of Economic Growth, and it's about how it is that you make societies grow, and you do that by freeing up prices, rather than controlling them, freeing up trade so that individuals can pursue mutually beneficial exchange, freeing up the mobility of labor so that, the most talented and most efficient workers get allocated towards their highest valued use. And what we are doing right now with national conservatism and the current administration is just a travesty of, economic ignorance. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm talking so about ignorance and fighting ignorance. Let's put Hayek in the context where he wrote his essay. I mean, it's actually quite a remarkable essay called "The Use of Knowledge in Society," which he wrote 80 years ago, last month in 1945. Um, what was Hayek trying to do in that essay?
So, the economics profession, um, from the time Hayek was educated and first taught at the London School of Economics in the early 1930s, the period of the 1930s and 1940s had seen a tremendous increase in the way we engaged in formal presentations of the market. So building models about how competitive markets work, and at the same time developing models of macroeconomic aggregation. And so you were moving in a more formalistic and more aggregative direction. And that took away from the focus on the choice of individuals and the interplay of individuals in the market. And that interplay of individuals in the market is guided by prices and also profit and loss. And Hayek had felt that the aggregation and the formalism of modern economics was clouding our perspective in understanding the role that prices play in a vibrant market economy. And so he gets a chance to write this essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which is trying to explain what prices do, as opposed to what they would represent in an equilibrium in which there's a unique P and Q vector that clears a market, which is what all his colleagues were working on. And so Hayek was talking about how prices are the vehicle by which we learn in our market competition how to better pursue our purposes and plans and coordinate with other individuals in the market. And so he was really focusing on this informational aspect of the price. So the market system has to discover, utilize, and then communicate the relevant knowledge to other actors so that suppliers and demanders can coordinate their activities to one another. And I have a quote in the piece where, Hayek says it's this disposition where if A doesn't do what's right, B will step in, right, to be able to do what's right to satisfy. And it's by doing that that we get this innovative machine that constantly produces more with less rather than less with more. So our very wealth is a function of our ability to realize these mutual gains from trade and discover least cost technologies. And we can't treat them as given. They have to be discovered and utilized and communicated. And so this is why Hayek was focusing on that aspect. Is I don't know if that was clear or not.
Yes, that was very clear. But and so the thing also I guess that follows from this is that even when this knowledge is discovered, like this equilibrium point that we reach is not everlasting, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, it's not just kind of like you discover and it's the end of the story. You can go
Right.
home, right? When most of economics was actually kind of trying to find this one point of equilibrium on which people would say, and the beauty of the market, I assume is also, I mean, I assume, I don't assume, I know is precisely the fact that this the world changes all the time, the information is generated all the time, and that when there is a change, when there is some change somewhere through the price system, the information is circulated and the equilibrium changes. So
Yeah.
it's like there's never an end goal. There's a particular moment in time, but it doesn't actually, it doesn't end there. I mean, you don't have that story, and it means that we can fix mistakes if mistakes were made. um, in a way that no one can do,
From
top down, right?
So I think that's perfect understanding of what Hayek's trying to get at. He's very explicit that the economic problem that he's trying to address is the problem of change, right? So rather than stasis, static equilibrium, it's about the change. And so therefore he needs to have a conception, a theoretical conception of markets, which is one that is constantly engaged in adaptation and adjustment. And this is a kind of a fascinating thing that relates to the kind of career path you've engaged in, by the way, because Tim Hartford has a book called Adapt, the economic journalist.
Hmm.
And that book actually has a deeper understanding of the way in which markets operate than what PhD students are told, you know, in their
Yeah.
classes, because the PhD students focus on the formal model, but they don't actually see the dynamic behavior of individuals in the market themselves. So Tim Hartford wrote this great book called The Undercover Economist, in
Hmm.
which, he goes around, sees the hidden mysteries of the universe around us. And then he has this book, Adapt. And he has another thing where he says that usually success begins with failure, right? So,
Yeah.
it's a profit and loss system. As you were mentioning before, we adapt, we make mistakes, we change, and all of that. And so, to give another person that I think actually has greater wisdom in the markets than a lot of the models is Matt Ridley. Matt Ridley in his book How Innovation Works, he has a great phrase. He says that innovation is the child of freedom, but the parent of prosperity, right? And so
Hmm.
if you could unpack that sentence, you would be
Yeah.
able to write
Yeah.
like a book after book after book. And so there's Hayek was really confused because the scientific understanding of the market prior to this aggregation and formalization was much more sensitive to these kind of questions, the entrepreneur, innovation, technological change, whatnot. And then all of a sudden it kind of like disappeared. And when it disappeared, it also gave a false confidence to engage in aggregate demand management on the macro side and microeconomic regulation or even planning on the micro side. And so he like woke up, in the 1940s and he was like, what the hell? What just happened here? Like, what, where did we lose the market in our study of markets? And so this was his effort to really get people, as he says, he was going to shock them out of their complacency by identifying the assumptions that had blinded them to the beauty of the market. And yeah, so that's,
So you
you know,
said that before economics became more formalized, like there was this understanding that the market was something. Basically, there was a different understanding of the market. So who were Hayek's biggest influence in actually? Uh,
so, Hayek's biggest influence were come out of the Austrian school. So Menger and Bombaverick, and then Mises, who was his
mhm.
mentor, not his teacher, but his mentor. But I would argue that you could also see this kind of discussion that I'm talking about in like Marshall. So if you read Marshall's principles and he tries to explain to you the nature of which markets operate, he gives you the higgling and bargaining of the fish market down at the seaboard, right? He explains the equilibrium process of the market like a stone at the end of a string hanging like a pendulum and it's going around. He gets done talking about the beautiful pattern that it will oscillate and lead to. But then he says, imagine that it's in now a river and the sea in the seawater. That's Marshall telling us that. So it's
Yeah.
not just supply and demand, a unique P and Q. You shock the demand curve, you have increase in demand. So then it adjusts like that. Yeah, all that stuff is there. That's in the background. But in the foreground was their great appreciation of the entrepreneurial market process. And by the time Hayek is writing, the entrepreneur is a nuisance in economics, right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, why the hell do we have to take that guy into account? And so people like Schumpeter and other people kept on saying that, trying to describe the market without an entrepreneur is like trying to tell, the story of Hamlet without a prince. But, there we were, and economics was doing that. And so people like Hayek and again, Mises is both his predecessor, but then becomes a contemporary kind of, because his career lasts that long. And they're all trying to get us to rediscover the dynamics of the market and why it is that planning can't work, because planning can't, uh, gather and access the necessary knowledge to to engage in rational calculation of alternative, uses of resources. And, all these people were pushing back against Keynesian economics that was rising, and then also market failure theory and planning theory as it was rising. So Hayek found himself embroiled in these two debates, which were the market socialist debate and the Keynesian debate. And, he was trying to push his colleagues to think differently. If you give me 1 minute, this issue about the marvel of the market is that Adam Smith tried to tell us that science progresses by going from awe, right, or wonder, to surprise, to appreciation. And so Hayek was trying to shock his contemporaries by forcing them once more again to find the mundane reality of economic life wondrous, right? It's like,
Yeah.
how is it that Paris gets fed, right? It is a
Yeah.
famous
Yeah.
Plastiac.
Yeah.
They had forgotten that. Adam Smith, how does the butcher, the baker, and the brewer give us our dinner? Like, they had forgotten the mystery of that. And so Hayek wanted to get them to see that wonder again, because then they would be surprised that it's about how we marshal self-interest among all this diverse population to be able to realize the gains from trade. And then they would appreciate that process of that. So you would go from wonder to surprise to appreciation, and economics would be advanced. When we cut out the wonder, right, we end up by losing the science. And so, in this sense, Hayek is the embedded argument is that the scientism of the 30s and 40s and 50s, the scientism was killing the science.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
wanted to get the science back. And so the science should not be like social physics, but instead more like, evolutionary biology or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I assume that those who were trying to kind of give a more scientific spin on who lost basically the marvel of the market and just thought that you could actually kind of direct it and see it and plan it and basically direct uh, market actors towards one particular outcome were doing it in part because they were dissatisfied with whatever it was the market was producing, and they thought they could do better. And I also assume that for some of the economists it was self-serving, right? Because if you can indeed do this, then it elevates economists to actually a place where they weren't really, that basically economists were, and this continues to this day, right, to actually tell you how you get to a particular outcome. So is that part of the story of what happened to economics? It was that people were, looking at the state of the world, and they were saying, "This is not what I want." Hence, that's we can improve on the market, and the tool of economics can help us do this. And oh, isn't that convenient? At the same time, it elevates economists to something that they were not meant to be.
Okay. So this is a multi-part
Yeah, yeah,
question. So I'm going to try to break it down and make it three things
yeah.
very quickly. I apologize if it
No, no,
seems
no.
right you off. But the first thing is I do think we have to remember that these developments really took off after the Great Depression.
Mhm.
And I think people had lost faith in capitalism because of the Great Depression. All right. So you have World War One, the Great Depression, and then eventually World War Two. So this is in Vienna, the Vienna Circle. It's been described as they were looking for exact thinking in demented times. right?
Hmm.
So you have all
Hmm.
these demented times going around. So you're trying to find exact thinking, and you're very frustrated with the natural course of life. You have, so you always have to remember that's the number one thing is it's against the background of World War One, Great Depression, World War Two.
I mean, in fact,
Second,
you, if I can interrupt, in your piece, you talk about how Hayek's idea were forged in crisis.
yeah,
World wars, depression,
yeah.
the authoritarianism, and
Yeah, his
uh,
whole life is World War One, Great Depression, World War Two, the Cold War.
yeah,
And then, he lived long enough to see the end of communism, but he was like really old at that point. He
yeah,
was
yeah,
born in
yeah, yeah,
1899 and died in 1992, right? But
yeah,
so okay, so that's the first thing is that there's this loss of faith in the market. John Maynard Keynes wrote an essay in 1927, and it's called "The End of Laissez-Faire."
yeah.
And his argument is that um, there is no order that emerges. It never came from God on down, and it never came from people on up. There is no such thing as an invisible hand. He basically argues. So let's get rid of that thinking. At the same time, now I'm going to justify why they moved to math in a second here, because the the older debates in economics were done in natural language. So a neoclassical economist could be French, could be German, could be English, and they were talking about the same things. Marginal utility, subjective value, all these opportunity costs. They were talking about all these things, and they were talking about in different languages. But they had a lot of subtle debates about capital theory, about other kind of things like that, and they kept on seeming like they were talking in circles, right? So
Hmm.
natural language is almost in many ways naturally ambiguous in a certain way, right? Because there's subtleties, and as there's different. You learn multiple languages, right? So there's different ways to say things and different, and so the idea is that, hey, all this ambiguity is because we're using the same words to mean different things, or different words to mean the same thing. So let's get rid of all of this ambiguity of natural language, and we'll substitute in, you know, formal language, and we can get rid of plausible reasoning and instead have axiomatic reasoning. And wouldn't our science be so much better if it was axiomatic rather than plausible reasoning? We could have QEDs at the end of our proofs, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a logic behind that. It's not like it was made up like in some
Mhm.
weird ass way, but it was just like, okay. But the problem that they forgot was that the older classical economists wanted to be logically sound, which meant that if my premises are true and my deductions are correct, my conclusions are true things about the world. But when I go to mathematics, I lose that. And instead, what I have is logical validity, meaning that it's only the coherence of the system itself. So it doesn't matter if my premises are true or not about the world. What matters is my deductions are airtight, then my conclusions, I can say, are coherent. My system is coherent, but it doesn't matter what it does in there. So for a long time, this mathematics stuff didn't take off because there still was a concern about how do I choose between all the logically coherent models. So statistics comes in.
Mhm.
And so now when you develop advanced models of statistics and collecting of data, now all of a sudden you could move from a situation where I don't really know between the logically coherent models which one to go with. Now I'm going to be able to supposedly sort them based on the empirical tests. So I will get rid of the logically coherent but not useful models because my empirics will tell me. But that assumed that the empirics was in fact unambiguous itself. And then we have a whole problem having to do with statistics and all of that. So that's what's led to this sort of situation. So Hayek is pushing back because a large part he's arguing not only against the models, which are not able to capture the dynamics, but also the statistical aggregates that were used to try to test the models. And he's arguing that's not going to do a job for us. And so this is why he writes the counter revolution of science. The third thing, and this is your point about the economist hour kind of idea.
Mhm.
If you read Mises, he says that the economist, this is in Human Action, he says the economist can never be the favorite of the kid, right? He's
Mhm.
always going to be the gadfly, or she's always going to be the gadfly to those in power who have this conceit. One of my favorite stories is about Juan Mariana, who's one of the early economists. He's an early school of Salamanca economist. He was a priest, but he was a philosopher. He wrote a whole book on why it's okay to kill the king. King didn't bother him at all. It's okay, like that, regicide. But he wrote a book on inflation and how the king was, basically clipping the coins, and they threw him in jail, right? So,
Yeah.
so economists have always been gadflies rather than servants of those in power. They're always the ones that are telling those in power, no, you can't pass those
No.
tariffs. That's not going to work. No, you can't have that protectionist legislation. That's not going to work, kind of thing like that. And in the 1930s, because again, we wanted to avoid the Great Depression from ever happening, we then transformed economics from a science of social understanding to a science of social control. And when you change the task of what economics is supposed to do, you change the tools that economists must have to do the task. And so, the you have a task, the education must match the task, and the tools must mask the task. And then we train you in the tools, to do that. And so economics during this time that Hayek is talking about transformed itself such that it could serve in theory the task of social control. And Hayek's argument is twofold, which is one, that's not the nature of economics, and second, uh, you know, you're not going to be able to do what you think you could do. And so, in his Nobel Prize address, he warns the economics profession that unless they fix this, they're going to end up by cheapening our science and turning us into charlatans. This is his Nobel Prize address. I mean, it's an amazing thing that he says this there. He says, we're going to become charlatans. And then the problem of being charlatans is that if we insist on staying in power, even though we don't have a science to profess, we risk becoming tyrants over our fellow citizens and destroyers of the very civilization. This is how he ends the Nobel. We're going to become tyrants and destroyers. And it's an amazing diagnosis that he's trying to get at, but it has its roots all the way back in this. Because if you can't understand what the function prices do, how the hell are you ever going to understand how the economic system operates?
Yeah.
And if you don't understand how it operates, how the hell are you ever going to control it?
And it is true. I mean, you're right that modern microeconomics and market structure models like still obscure rather than illuminate how economies
And
actually
this is
work.
our biggest problem at the
Yeah.
moment, intellectually in our context, is because uh, there's been a period of great forget. So since the global financial crisis, there's been a kind of a great forget period. We forgot what we learned about the failure of macroeconomics, and we forgot what we learned about the failure of antitrust regulation, right? And so
Yes.
think about someone like under the past administration, Leah Khan. She's bringing back antitrust ideas from like 50 years ago, which have been defeated in research, for a 30-year period. And then she was brought back in. Macroeconomics, again, the attempt to try to aggregate demand. And think about just the debate that took place, over the, COVID and the inflation. Is this team temporary, or is this team,
Yeah.
monetary manipulation? It was like crazy. It was like going back in time.
But let me ask you this. Um, so, Lina Khan, do you think what's happening here is that the state of antitrust knowledge, basically, that had been prevailing since what would you say, the 80s?
80s, yeah.
80s, yeah. The 80s, right? Was based in a lot of debates, papers, and experience. Then comes along a new batch of young lawyers who've not been maybe educated in that debate, these papers, and basically revert to the most basic instincts that most people have. Is it this, or is it simply that she knows all of this, and her lived experience of what really actually is going on, uh, is just contradicts like what she's seen. She looks at the world and it doesn't look what she thinks it should look like, and hence she decides it's time for a new model. This model has failed us. Which one do you think it is?
So let me say that, she did not uh, come up with a new model. There's a reason why they were called
Well,
the
yeah,
Newborn
that's true.
Lyceum,
Yeah, yeah.
right? There's a reason why they're called the Newborn Lyceums. They just went back to the older model. So they resurrected structure, conduct, performance, paradigm of IO, which had been overturned. But the issue is I think it's just a matter of tombstones, meaning that the people who had revolutionized industrial organization from the period from 1950 to 1980 had all started to die off.
Mhm.
And with that, they're not being live parts of the curriculum. And then, of course, there's been technological changes. We didn't have platform economies, when
Mhm.
Harold Demsetz was writing, or Yale Brosen was teaching at Chicago. And now we have those things. We also have had a large amount of rent seeking activity, which means that we have concentrations in industries that are not due to market forces, but due to government favoritism, and that got confused with it being the natural outgrowth of a market. So we misidentified. We had a category error, which is that the government had put its thumb on the scale to favor some at the expense of others. And then we somehow said, oh, well, that's the natural outcome of the market, rather than the idea that this was because we purchased monopoly, which is like an old article of Demsetz, right? The purchasing of
Yeah,
monopoly
yeah, yeah.
power and stuff. And so the solution is different. If I identify that it's the government putting this thumb on the scale to favor some at the expense of others, I get rid of the thumb. But if it's the natural outcourse, I put the thumb on more. Well, what's the outcome of that? When I put the thumb on more, what do? I get more and more. So, just to put this in perspective, even Bill Baumol, who was a very conventional economist, in the 1980s, he published papers on the strategic use of business, a strategic use of government by business to protect themselves, right? This is the entrepreneurship guy. And he even understood. And so when he writes his famous paper on entrepreneurship, he divides it up into, productive and unproductive entrepreneurship. And the unproductive is, when, individuals seeking the gains from trade or whatever, or the gains from trade from the coercive powers with the state, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's we've seen, like, you and me and everyone else, our whole professional career, all we've seen is a huge expansion of this rent-seeking state, not a curtailing of this rent-seeking state. I would put a lot of the blame on that of after 9/11, because I think that the whole connection with what the security state entailed. This is how 8 of the 10 richest counties in America, ended up by being located here in the Washington, D.C. area, as opposed to Washington being the capital, but second cities were richer: New York,
Yeah.
Chicago, LA.
Mhm.
That's when you see a vibrant, when the capital city, this is a hypothesis I have, right? When the capital city is the richest area in your country, you have a rent seeking society. When the capital city is not the richest, but other areas are, then you have an entrepreneurial economy. And I think we've become less entrepreneurial and more rent seeking, despite the fact that we've also had tremendous growth. I mean, I don't want to deny that. I mean, we have 330 million people, $1 trillion economy. The size of this country, as long as we have, free flow relative between states, we kind of can simulate like a giant, trading zone or whatever. And so we've experienced tremendous increases in wealth, but we also have experienced tremendous increases in government distortions. But it's precisely because we have so much accumulated wealth that we're able to be stupider than we than
No.
some of the other countries like in Europe and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So their rent-seeking behavior, which is just as bad as ours, pinches more, because they're operating at a lower level of productivity. But to me, I think this is the big missing gap. And if I could just add one more thing on that, this is like when I look at the social mobility studies, like Chetty or whatever. And it's really important work. I mean, it's great stuff. But the issue is that the reason why we have had a gumming up of our labor market is because our labor market has become more like the European labor market than like less European.
Mhm.
And as a result, it's what Casey Mulligan calls the redistribution recession, right? We've actually, and so as a result, we haven't, we're still have movement among the quintiles, but they don't move as fast as they once did, precisely because we've gummed up the labor market. And if you don't, if you make it easy to fire people, it's easy to hire people. and
Yeah.
and so we need a more fluid labor market, and then we'll see more mobility
And
going.
we haven't just reduced the rate of mobility. We're like the rate of economic growth has also declined quite dramatically since the beginning of the 2000s. I mean, and economic growth is not just good for, uh, lifting all boats and producing wealth for everyone. It is actually kind of there's the Benjamin Friedman book about the morality of economic growth is like it's like it breeds peace and tolerance and
All the other
all
things.
of this, yeah. And it is, I mean, as you were talking, I was actually thinking that you're right. Like when like going back to the Lena Khan a question I asked you, like I think a lot of people were radicalized during the Great Recession because the banks and the financial system that was seen as the cause, ignoring all the government action that actually led them to have, all sorts of behavior, but led to the Great Recession, were also the ones that were bailed out. And it was kind of interesting that people were demanding that those that were being bailed out by the government, uh, likely for action uh, that were encouraged by the government or certainly by markets that were heavily distorted by government action, government regulations, government rewards that led to this situation. It's the same government that they were asking to intervene more in these markets, hence like creating this vicious cycle.
So think about, I'm gonna mention a couple books here. One of them by our close colleague Tyler Cowen. If you look at his Great Stagnation book, right? What does he focus on? The three sectors. Go back and check this. The three sectors are going to be health, education, and then government services itself. And then he points out, oh, look at the decline in productivity in each one of those. Again, like, okay, so what's the common factor between all of them, right?
Yeah.
Is the tremendous tentacles of the state in every single area that is in. So, of course, we're going to see this kind of, difficulty.
And the
I
same
think
is true.
that,
The same is true with the rise in prices, right? When you look
yeah,
at different goods and industries where prices have declined versus where prices have gone up, the one where prices have gone up are like heavily regulated.
government
Yeah, yeah,
regulated and
yeah.
everything. Yeah. And the other, issue with all of this stuff is just that when we look at this period of time that you're talking about, and then you look at the problem that we face now. So you read a new book out right now by like Ezra Klein's book on abundance.
Mhm.
And you start in the beginning of the book and you get excited because it's about what's the whole thing that they're telling you need to do. You need to get rid of housing regulation. You need to get rid of energy regulation, right? Because this is going to do this. You're going to embrace technology, like, make
Mhm.
sure that we embrace, AI and all those other things like that. And then, two-thirds through the book, they start reintroducing all these things again for the government to come like roaring back in. But it's the government that caused all the problems in the first place that they recognize
Yes.
with housing and everything else. And so to me,
And
I
their
think,
big case, I mean, in their defense, and I agree entirely with you. This is why this is a book that is it's extremely frustrating for people like us because the first part of the book, you're like kind of duh. Like we've been saying this for literally ever. And the second part of the book, and it wasn't meant for us, it was they're talking to people on the left. It's basically, look, the government could do so much more with the money it taxed from the private sector if only it didn't have to live with the regulations and all the distortion created by the government. But I also think in their defense that they're not they're not talking to us.
Yeah.
They're really talking to people on the left.
Yeah, I know they're trying to seduce them into an agenda of a pro-growth agenda. I get that, right?
A pro-growth agenda for the sake of bigger government.
Yeah.
So it's like, "Ugh."
Yeah, but the issue is that you can't kill the goose that lays a golden egg, right? And
Exactly.
you do that by getting involved and stuff. And so, just to give you another book, again, I think it's a very, very important book. But in the Asamoah and Robinson book, The Narrow
Mhm.
Corridor, if you look at the way they do it, the ideal society is going to have a big state and a big society, right? It's not like it's going to have a small state and big society. It's going to have big state, big society, and then it's going to have, you'll get, Denmark, and you won't be Myanmar, or you won't be China, kind of thing. And so to me, I think that this is it's like a Goldilocks approach,
Mhm.
to this balance. And instead, I think we need to think about government as, what Adam Smith says is that we should try to, I mean, Smith says that you can discharge the sovereign of responsibilities. The way I would put this is it's not so much our debates are not so much turning on the size of government, that is starving the state of resources. It's about starving the state of responsibility. So in order for us to realize the kind of thing that Matt Ridley is talking about, that innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity, it's it's getting rid of the scope of government, reducing that scope of government so that it's out of your way, so that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. It's one of my favorite passages in all of practical economics is by Thomas Sowell. It's at the very end of Knowledge and Decisions, and he basically makes this argument that demands for our freedom and liberty are demands so that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, rather than the idea that we need to give power to extraordinary people so that extraordinary things can get done. And if you think about it and you even put it in pressure points, like think about where the sentiments were in COVID of where we put our faith in. Our faith was, oh, we need to have a boss, right? And we need to give the boss a lot of
Mhm.
control, rather than the idea of, wow, there could be really cool entrepreneurial innovations here to be able to make sure that we could eat at a restaurant, and eat safe, or we could go to school and not have a problem. And all these kind of things are, therapeutics, and you don't need it to have a cure. You need it to have a reduction of the risk, right? That's all you need to do is have a risk mitigation strategy, not a zero risk, but just, lower it enough that, we have it now. We all fly. And every time we fly, we could get like the flu or whatever else we
Yeah.
have. Yeah. But as long as you have a risk mitigation strategy, and who's best to come up with that? The state, or a one size fits all kind of approach, or the competitive, nimble and creative entrepreneurs in society. And I think that our biggest problem in communicating is that, in some sense, I would say that maybe prior to the global financial crisis, we kind of had a little bit more of the sway in the public discourse about the nimble and like creative entrepreneur, and then that kind of lost its way. But now maybe it's coming back again with AI and the tech stuff and everything. We can start talking about that again. But that's our key thing, is that appreciation of how the entrepreneurs, is our solution to our coordination problems.
I like the way you put it. Like instead of starving the government for resources, starve the government for responsibilities. And this is why Doge ended up failing, right? It's
Yes.
because the idea was just to cut stuff without actually a theory of, okay, what should the government do? And what are the responsibilities that the government should stop doing? Because effectively they're cutting programs, but I mean, and the legality of it is, you know, is in question. But as long as Congress doesn't actually put an end to this program, this is never going to go away.
Yeah.
So, but you've
It
mentioned
also
that.
sets the motion up of where, for example, even with respect to private charitable groups, if you don't have a very strong notion about the idea of the responsibilities of the state versus responsibility of citizens,
Mhm,
you'll always turn to the state for scalability reasons.
mhm,
If I have a local charitable group and it satisfies my local community poverty alleviation
mhm.
in Arlington or something, right? And so it's successful. Then the next thing is, if it's successful there, why not all of Fairfax County? If
Yeah,
it's successful in all of Fairfax County, why not all of Virginia? If all of Virginia, why not the United States? And the only way you can scale that way is if the government gets its tentacles in it. And then once it does it, it loses its vibrancy and efficiency. So the people that are
not only
involved,
because it actually loses the
yeah.
local knowledge.
And so the people that are at the founding of it have to have a sense of what self-governance is and what responsibility is and all of this. And so this is why it's a big educational task, education in the broadest sense, not just in school,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah,
just in
yeah, yeah.
society in general. And because we have to actually get people. So one of the things, I don't normally quote Lincoln all that much,
Mm,
but he has an essay called On Fragments of Government. And in that essay, he has a great way of summarizing this up. He says that government should do those things and only those things that private citizens cannot do for themselves and government can do well. All
yeah,
right. So
that's like
that's
these are
actually,
very two.
yeah, so
Two.
that's an empirical question on two fronts.
Yeah, yeah.
So, we as scientists should be exploring that all over the place, right? Which is, so it's not just government failure theory, it's also how it is that markets can serve as vehicles to solve social problems. Um, I don't know if you read the biography of Milton Friedman by Jennifer
Yeah,
Berg.
yeah, yeah. Mhm,
I mean, a lot of people have problems with it because of her title and all this things like
mhm,
that. But I actually think it's a really, really good book. I'm a big fan of it. But she has a chapter in there which is called Room 7
mhm,
Economics. And it was about the application of all of this. So this is what I meant earlier about understanding the price theory is not just the formal models, but the economy coming to life, kind of thing. And the whole point is using economics to solve social problems. And that's like what Friedman as a student is involved in. That's what, Aaron Director is involved in. That's what, Henry Simons is teaching them. It's from Frank Knight. And it's all in that idea that you can take economics, you can apply it to everything. So, school choice issues, right? Like, how am I going to solve the problem of schools? Well, give choice to the parents, right? Let the schools be entrepreneurial. These kind of solutions don't sit like obvious to a lot of people because they're counterintuitive. Like you were
mhm,
mentioning about Leah Khan before. So they're counterintuitive, but a large part of economics is to actually make you see that competition is the way to get peaceful cooperation.
mhm.
People think competition leads to conflict. No, it's the opposite. You have conflict, competition lets you get out of the conflict to get peaceful resolution. And that's an economic way of thinking about these things.
That's one of the things that actually frustrates me the most. Maybe one of the things that frustrates me the most about modern economics. I don't know how modern it is actually.
Yeah.
It's like the starting point is like competitive market, perfectly competitive market, and then they look at the real world and they're like, oh,
Yeah.
what's this outcome? And they're just like, it's like, no, but what is wrong with the real world, right?
Yeah.
Rather than actually ever think that maybe their starting point, the starting point of the models are just not like, and it always makes me, it always frustrates me because you see this type of thinking like literally everywhere. And maybe what we need is like actually really much better understanding of price theory. But let's go back actually.
Can I
Let's
say something real
Yeah,
quick
yeah,
about that?
yeah.
I apologize. I'm going to do a shameless plug because I'm working on a book with my colleague Rosalino Candela
Yeah.
which is called price theory as prophylactic. It comes from a phrase of Henry Simon's. But what we argue in there is, I don't know if you've ever seen this piece or the listeners, but Deirdre McCloskey has a wonderful piece in which she lists all of the so-called market failures. There's
Hmm.
120 of
Yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah.
All right. And so what we're trying to do in our book is show the power of price theory to address each and every one of these criticisms, and we divide it into three kind of responses. The first one is that a lot of so-called market failures that people reason about are because the theorist doesn't draw the cost curves in the right place. If they
Hmm.
drew the cost curves in different places. So that's that first one is conceptual clarity. The second one is that they treat the institutions as so far in the background that they're not even understood. So Coase and Buchanan come along and they say, look, you can change the rules and you'll change the outcomes. So change the legal arrangements or you
Hmm.
change the political structures. And then the third one is today's inefficiency is tomorrow's profit for the entrepreneur
Exactly.
who's able to act on it.
And we go back to where we were in the
Yeah,
beginning, which is ultimately whatever point you're at this particular moment where you draw your supply and demand curve, like it's going to move. It's going to
yeah,
continue to evolve. And when it doesn't work out, there's an opportunity for someone to step in with
yeah.
innovation or more supply or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
And
think about this. Think about how radical the world changes with the invention of barbed wire,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
And just like this is innovation, you come along, and so all of a sudden it changes everything. Or the assignment of again, go back to Coase, rearrangement of the property rights. Go back to Buchanan, change of the political rules of the game. You know, all of these things have these impacts, and then the key one we argue is this alert and creative entrepreneurs in the marketplace, always discovering those opportunities. And just to bring it back to the paper, what I want to try to communicate to people as best as I can is that, this is just, it's independent of any school of economic thought. It's just basic economics, which is we live in a world of scarcity. Scarcity implies trade offs. Trade offs need to be negotiated. We need aids to the human mind to negotiate those. And in commercial society, they come in the form of property rights, relative prices, profits, and losses. Property incentivizes us, prices guide us, profits lure us, losses discipline us.
Yeah.
And if you're not going to use property prices and profit and loss, you got to come up with some other mechanism. And when we study those other mechanisms of coping with those trade offs, voting, administrative setting, all these things, like they don't comparatively do as well in being able to solve our social dilemmas. And so when we have an administration or we have an intellectual movement like Orrin Cass or one of these other people that are, supposedly rejecting, economics, and they poo-poo it or whatever, what they're ushering in is a nightmare for their own point of view, right? So they are going to end up by not achieving their goals, and in fact worsening the very world that they want to avoid. They're going to actually get it more worse, and economics can demonstrate that to them. And we have a whole multiple centuries of history of showing this, but somehow they're oblivious to it at the moment. And so you know they look, Vera, I'm going to go off a little bit. I'm rather annoyed by this, but the other night, JD Vance, this is Halloween 1930, October 31. This was 2 nights ago. JD Vance gave this talk where he said that not only do we want to get rid of illegal immigrants, that's bad enough itself, but he says we want to reduce the number of legal immigrants, which is just suicide, right? Because think about all the talent, intellectual, right? And then in Florida, DeSantis told the universities to get rid of the HB1, and J1 visa
Yeah.
holders, right? I
Mhm.
mean, like, this is just insanity what we're engaged in at the
That's
moment.
well, it's planning at
Yes.
it is really planning. And no, I mean I totally agree. And to go back to your article, like one of the cases that you make is that the knowledge problem, the and the marvel of the market as an aggregator of all that information, as a telecommunication system
Yeah.
of all of these things that no one could grasp, is going to remain superior to any planner, even if we have AI, even if we have the most powerful computers, even but you have this sense, and it's been true forever. I mean, that like people who thought that somehow technology could beat the market.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's frustrating, right?
You have to understand that that's always, I mean, you alluded to this, but people have always made that argument. That's not new to computers today.
No.
Because if you go back throughout the whole history of development, they've always thought like the latest development technique is going to replace the market. So at one time it was scientific management, at another time it was linear programming, right? It was, when econometrics was first invented, it was called planometrics. We're going to use econometrics to solve so everything, all these iterations. So the techno socialism or techno communism is like real. It's a debate that people are having. It's ongoing. I had an earlier Wall Street Journal article this summer with
Mhm.
Marian Tupy on this issue as well. Plus, I've written some papers on this, and it's it's not going to be settled by one paper or things like that because it's in the popular imagination at the moment. But it's all missing what Hayek is trying to get at because again, the market isn't solving only a computational problem. It's a generative problem. The knowledge that's required for us to negotiate these trade-offs only gets generated within the process of competitive bids and asks. If you don't have that competitive process, you don't get the knowledge. It just doesn't exist. It's
Yeah,
not like, oh, there's lots of knowledge there and I just have to access it. It's that it literally doesn't exist because we didn't engage in the thing that produced it. And
exactly.
and so this is what they're missing because they think it's just a computational problem. Everything's out there and we just have to find the right mix or whatever. Uh,
And to go back to your immigration this question, and to something I've said from the beginning, which I always find really frustrating, is like you have all these people who are fast to point to a market failure, here in this case, and like immigration, like they think that what they call market failure, what they call what they is basically like the market producing something that they don't like.
yeah.
Somehow they think that they don't like. And what it means is if you want to override the outcome that has been produced by the market, I don't know if immigration actually is the product is the product of some markets with enormous government rules. But if you want to override the outcome of the market, what you effectively have to do is assert power over the market, meaning millions of people, millions of producers, millions of consumers. And that's like, I mean, I think it's visible. It's visible, like it's very visible right now. I mean, I'll say it was very visible, with the previous administration, and all that. It's getting worse and worse and worse and worse
But
every iteration.
yeah, this is the problem with the distinction between, you know, uh, like high quality immigrants and low quality immigrants.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you never know, right? When people come here, you go and you study the history. Think about market oriented thinking. Milton Friedman starts Free to Choose, the TV show, and the very first scene is immigrants in New York City during the immigration wave, and how individuals came here and were able to be these great innovators of the American economy in the 20th century,
Mhm.
right? So families like his own family, right, who had come here from Russia. His mom had to work in the textiles, to begin with, and then eventually, the family grows and they have a Nobel Prize winning son, right? First
Mhm.
generation kid. I'm always reminded when I think about this of Julian Simon's story of the priest in Normandy, where he looks at all the dead bodies and he says, how many of these are the next Mozart? How many of these could have been the next Einstein, things like that.
Hmm.
Well, it's the same thing with immigration, right? We want to,
You never know.
open up and have all these things. And our problem, if we can identify the problem in immigration, it's as you put it, it's the government restrictions on the integration of individuals into the labor market that cause, a large part of our problems, that if we have
There-
any problems with
Yes.
immigration. If instead individuals could come here and be able to integrate seamlessly into the labor market, we would end up by seeing individuals come here and be the kind of people like we've seen, like who come up with the pharmaceuticals, who are the better athletes, right? Yeah. So
Well,
take a look at the World Series right now. How many of the people at World Series that are growing up are native born Americans as opposed to,
and of
from
course,
Dominican,
you
from,
can't you can't
Spain.
you can't screen for this. You can't say, well, we're only going to bring in
Yes.
those who are going to become
Yeah.
the people we want. This is
Yeah.
not how it works.
Yeah. They have to be
And
discovered.
and there is something that is magic about the American system that
Yeah.
in fact turns people who would be low skill immigrants and who enters here as low skill immigrants who have the ability to express their potential, a potential they may not even know they had, because that too is a discovery process. The person that you are, you don't know until you actually find ways to discover it and to become that
And
person.
that's because of what America used to be, standing for freedom and their ability
Exactly.
to integrate. And so that's how you get this. I just to give you a story of someone who helped us here at George Mason for many years was this woman, Thelma Weaver. She's, unfortunately, she lived to be over 100. She's now passed away. But we used to have a fellowship named after her called the Olafson Weaver Fellowship. And her father's Olafson. He came here from Sweden at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. He had no money, zero. He migrated to Detroit, worked, found in his head that there could be a tool and die industry. And he got involved in the tool and die industry and amassed a fortune. But he came here with nothing. He was nothing. He didn't come here. He didn't have, like the most advanced degree. He wasn't like, no one would have said, oh, he's going to come here and be like, work in a lab or do pharmaceuticals or whatever. He was just a guy who was coming here to try to have a better life than he ever could have had in
Mhm.
Sweden. And he was desperate and he was able to integrate himself because he was an immigrant, see an opportunity that other people weren't seeing because
Yeah.
a fish doesn't recognize the water it swims in, and so he comes in, he sees the world differently than others, he's able to operate on it, and boom, he, like that. And that's what, to me, is what makes our country great.
Yes.
And I want us to keep having that aspect of our country and to keep having it be great. And so it's again, how many Mozarts, how many, Einsteins, how many, you know uh, uh, you know, um, great baseball players or whatever, great basketball player, all these things in the arts, commerce, literature, all of that, that all comes from this blending of the free flow of labor and capital throughout the world. And that was one of the great, you know, reasons for the expansion and growth of the West, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
we don't want to threaten that because we don't want to be stuck back again in the period of time prior to the Great Enrichment.
Yeah. On these note, I want to commend everyone to go and read Pete's piece at the Dispatch called "What Hayek Understood About the Unknowable Nature of Markets." Thank you, Pete. This was great.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time and talking to me. So thank you.